Warraba, I want to actually talk about the title. Titles are often can be more about concealment than they can about telling you what's in a show. But I think with this one, it's quite clear. What is the shadow and what is the substance?
So when I was thinking about the title, I was looking at a text by Nicholas Mirzoff titled "The Shadow and the Substance," and it was talking about the history of slavery in America. Just jump down the front here. And so looking at those experiences and the similarities within Australia, particularly for indentured servitude, slavery, and those histories, but also the way that blackfellas have been represented throughout history. And so another part of that is thinking about shadow as in a sort of an artefact of the physical. So thinking about history in that way, and then the substance of what exists right now. So a bit of a perspective of historical to the contemporary.
I often think about the I guess if there's a the crux of the issue is, I think, a major difference between the way we understand, perhaps you and I might understand the past and the contemporary, and that is that the past is contemporaneous with the present. It isn't the past. And I think perhaps our understanding of linear time might be a little different. I know I was brought up with a very flat understanding of I guess, time. Where do you sit on this question of the contemporaneity of the past? Is because someone could say, why does he make work about the past, what they call the past, and or history?
Well, I think that it's very easy to see that we are directly and intimately connected to that history. Nothing is separating that, and they all inform each other. And all of those histories and social dynamics, politics are all a part of that same equation. So to think about the work and some of the content, I think that it might be convenient for people to think about, or maybe easier to manage the layers of politics and social racism, things of that nature. It might be easy just to isolate that to the past, but to really identify how physical violence historically has then transformed into systemic and structural violence is really the way that people need to start thinking, because I can very much guarantee that those things didn't stop historically. They just changed tactic, and a lot of the times that is enacted through social systems like criminal justice system, education, health, and we have people talking about closing the gap and all those statistics and things like that, but yet we still have the same people in those positions that are telling us how to do it, how to implement it, and what is necessary, instead of really listening to Aboriginal people. I feel like we're all very familiar with the concept of self-determination and cultural autonomy, but yet we're yet to really see that in this country. I would question if we ever have.
And we've been talking about, this idea of the medium, and because it's not just work. It's not just you go into a studio and you make this stuff and it has no recourse to contemporary events, or it's just about the past. But you choose art as the medium through which you speak. Yeah. Some people might use a microphone. Some people write. Some people, affect cultural change in other ways. Why did you choose the medium of visual art?
I'm kind of not sure, but I'm also, I think it was just a natural progression that, at the time I was interested in art. I was raised in a pretty politically active family, and so we're always having those conversations. So there's one thread there where, culturally we've always incorporated those social dynamics and things that are happening through creative practice, whether that's visual or performative. But then I think that there's an element where I started to learn that it's a different way for people to access and interpret difficult information. So that people have to interpret the work before they can actually respond to it. And I think that usually having those conversations, whether it's watching my parents at a boardroom conversation or a rally, or conversations I'm having myself with peers, that it's very easy to respond with aggression or emotional projections for people that are triggered in some way. But much I think it just encourages a different way of interpreting the information if you have time to reflect on it and then think about your own position with it.
I mean, creating images for the public, creating images to build a sense of shared responsibility, and of how we're all implicated, every one of us, in the past, is always a big challenge. But you've created these works, six works. I always think of them as being like part of they're collaged. They're almost like interdependent, and of moments in a much greater body of work, which is your output. And I said on social media that every work is a refinement of a larger body of work. You can really see you've thought this through. And when I wrote about your work in 2017 on the occasion of your first solo exhibition at Metro Arts in Brisbane, I talked about institutional lies, for me, which is one of the most compelling things about the show. Just talk about that incredible sculpture, which I think it deserves to be writ large in a very public place, somewhere in this country.
Yeah, so I was born in 1987, at the same time that the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody was established. And then so thinking about that timeline, thinking about the growing amount of deaths in custody and how things have gotten worse, I really wanted to dig deep into that and create a work of art about it that really critiqued those systems and the normalisation of that. I can remember always being at those rallies, being 6-7 years old, going to the rally for Daniel York and protesting with everyone else, numerous times of doing stuff like that. So something very familiar that I wanted to create work about. So the other element to that is wanting to create a sculpture so big and dominant that it actually looked like a monument in itself. So, obviously we all know that there's so many colonial figures that have their own statues that are acknowledged, that have plaques, recognising a particular type of history and celebrating those things. And sometimes there isn't the ability for Australian society to then create something that they're not really proud of. And then so I think that people really need to be encouraged to think about monuments, possibly the anti-monuments, thinking about ways that we can talk about really difficult histories, and each of us taking responsibility and being accountable of not only that history and what we benefit from that history, whether it's our families or the places where we work, but making sure that we're not perpetuating those things as well. And that also comes with supporting other people who share the same struggles. And the more the more closer we look at those things, we're able to identify that there's way more similarities than there are differences. But so the work, do you want me to talk about that?
Yeah, please let's talk about the work.
So it's based off. There's a lot of research. The whole installation at the time was based off Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, so the surveillance prison architecture scheme, where the prisoner can't see the warden up in the tower, and so they start self-censoring their behaviour. So the optics of surveillance and those, I guess the psychology of it becomes so debilitating that the prisoner then changes their behaviour.
They effectively become a part of the machine.
Yeah. And so pairing that with a craniometer, interchanging the measuring pins that you would measure a cranium with spears, and changing out the cranium for a globe of the earth. And so I guess metaphorically that relationship is the globalization of that ideology of, globalization of the colony. That is something that is so directly responsible for the over-criminalisation and representation of black bodies and how people are incarcerated today.
I mean, this, your entire life, and you made that work institutionalised, the work that we're talking about. This one here, part of a much, and there you can see it in its original context. This is with all the other work around it, but this is the central power apparatus of this work called institutionalised. And this is your debut show. I mean, that's incredible to think of the scale and the work involved in producing a sculpture like that. There's also a lack of self-consciousness, like to go big like that in your first show. I mean, I don't know where you get the bravery or the chutzpah from, but that is, and this is the work I wrote about. So here the globe is very much a globe, but it's according to the craniometer. The craniometer used to measure the head. Talk about how that kind of practice of studying our bodies, measuring anthropometrically our bodies, how that also kind of resonates with our over incarceration.
Yeah, well, there's a long history of what's deemed now pseudoscience, and it's not valid as a pursuit of fact or science or whatever you want to call it. But many of those threads, so to speak, still exist and are informing contemporary dynamics. So, things like physiognomy, where you're looking at the shape of a cranium and that's going to predetermine some racial hierarchy. Racial hierarchy as a social construct in itself, that there's some biological difference between all human species, which is bullshit. Thinking about the differences between culture and things like this. So there's all of these things that have happened over the course of history where Indigenous peoples have been placed as the other. Anywhere around the world you can take that template of colonialism and it fits. And so, measuring limbs, skin colour, cranium sizes, all of these things that are so unethical primarily just to dehumanize a group of people. The way that, you think about photography started in 1870s, then you look at there's a French police officer, Alphonse Bertillon, who came up with the Bertillon composition, where you have the front-on portrait and the side-on portrait, which we all know as the mugshot. That was created to then look at the cranium size of degenerates and that people were predisposed to become criminals. If they had broader noses, higher eyebrows, and a lot of the time they were European people of low socioeconomic areas as well. So it's not just Indigenous peoples around the world, but there is definitely an overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in that particular system.
So the mugshot is this replication of a practice started by Bertillon, was he an anthropologist? Photographer.
He was a police officer, but I think he was also like amateur sort of biologist, anthropologist, something.
And these practices, like the anthropometry, measuring our bodies and skin color, and photographing us, all these practices go to one point, and that is objectification. Taking the human subject and turning them into an object, which I think is everything. Is it racism? Is it colonialism? Is it what people do to each other throughout history? Creating an object out of a subject. But I'm still interested in this question of why this event, the 1987 Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, which spans your entire life, institutionalised, you make it's the 30th anniversary. So you grew up in a very political home. Your mum and dad are here in the audience. Talk a little bit about growing up in that kind of cauldron, that kind of hotbed, and of being active but in a different way to your dad.
Yeah, like I think like whether it's at home or at school or wherever it might be, we're always having conversations around politics, around repatriation of ancestral remains. Dad was heavily involved in that for a number of decades, and then we would always be talking about these things. The sort of the sad truth of it is that racism is so rampant within Australia that the experiences are so vast. So it's always something to talk about some of those experiences. I think it was good to have an awareness of the struggle and understanding the histories of those, but also that there's a continual lack of understanding or support by the dominant society in trying to change that, as well as consecutive governments that don't act on things, and it's just seen as symbolic politics rather than actually affecting genuine change.
Now, we talked in the Ambassadors Lounge about your practice as being a catalyst for something. Now, a lot of art, we're in an institution where perhaps a lot of the art was made for no reason, to catalyse nothing. I'm being honest. A lot of contemporary art could be accused of catalysing nothing. So the idea that art must do something is not held by everybody. So if your practice is a catalyst for something, what is your practice a catalyst for?
Yeah, I sometimes get, I know it's slightly taboo, but I kind of just get sick of talking about your art and this material or this sculpture, because they're all, like you said, like they're a catalyst for something else. Like I create work to have social change, to inform people, to critique things and have that be a broader discourse. And so when we have conversations like this, I want to talk about the importance of that, not having it as like, some other thing removed from that. And so I think that's really important, and I think many people are doing that and contributing to that. And it's really, my work usually has two components, and I'll do circles in my head for a long time, processing and thinking about things until they're resolved. But I always have a direction where I want to critique a certain scenario within Australian society. I want to create accessibility for non-Indigenous peoples, so they build that understanding if they don't already have it, and doing that by using very familiar materials, and then subverting that or altering that to then kind of build that literacy of what that form is and the relationships it has. Then I always try to add in a cultural perspective, whether that's process-led or whether that's actually visually there, to make sure that I'm making work for a broad audience who can see things in various ways. And often those cultural elements will be opaque to many other people, and unless you have that understanding or that familiarity with some of those forms. But yeah, I think it's always just trying to initiate conversation, because I think that as simple as, or maybe as naive as that is, just to have a conversation, I feel like that, that knowledge and sharing that is really important, and that's kind of where it all stems from. Then hopefully people have enough courage to then do something about it.
It's, as Megan was saying, it's been a very busy time. It needs to be said that there are many things that might prevent you from having a flourishing career, in which your day job as a lecturer at the Queensland College of Art of Griffith University. You're lecturing in the degree course for Indigenous Contemporary Art, which has produced some extraordinary makers. You graduated from that course too, didn't you? So another incredible alumnus. You got Vernon Archie, you got Tony Albert. List goes on, and that course, the course foundation, it should be said, Richard Bell, Marshall Bell, Michael Ether, Jennifer Hurd, some really important, and Laurie Nielsen, all there at this important time, setting up this course, ideally for mature age students, for older fellas, a bachelor degree in Indigenous Contemporary Art. So you're seeing all the new young fellas come through who are just like you. What are you seeing in those? Is there the same level of promise that there was, maybe in the time of Vernon Archie?
It ebbs and flows. Like I think there's a number of students that go there for a range of different reasons. Some people want to be artists. Some people want to regenerate things within their families. Could be a number of other things. And so I think it's not always having the kind of interest to be a practicing artist. But there's different elements that are necessary to kind of strengthen things, not even just within the sort of university setting, but elsewhere as well. Like Vernon Archie will talk really great about the need for Indigenous critique. And so that's one thing that we do at Kaya, and are constantly trying to improve that. But having the ability to have rigorous, informed critique, keyword there being informed, and having real traction in that, because too many people still think that Aboriginal art is purely dot art and is a certain region and things like that, and so I think just really even though how long that conversation's been going for, really trying to position interdisciplinary broader practices and that people can understand them as valid and not just kind of anchored to some static point in history.
You're very much part of this. I mean, it's probably a shame. It would suggest that I have been doing for 30 years not a very good job and that is trying to communicate this idea of the depth and diversity of contemporary Indigenous art, and that is multiform. It doesn't look like you imagine. Well, it does actually. It looks like contemporary art. You know, it is contemporary art. All of it is contemporary art, even the dots. So are you still finding that are you still encountering that kind of level of, that base level of knowledge about Aboriginal art?
Yeah, all the time. It could be from people that aren't familiar with the arts and don't really engage with that type of stuff. It can be other people that are in the arts but just haven't really ventured out to Indigenous practices. There's a whole kind of mixed bag, but I think it's important to draw that thread to the work and the issues that are spoken about within that body of work downstairs. That it's because of these cultural archetypes that are written about us, is describing who we are and who we aren't and what that corresponds to. That's purely why we have just this one kind of version of what Aboriginal art is. That and the ongoing narrative within the tourist kind of narrative. So, and I think that when we zoom out of that, we realise that both of those narratives are led by non-Indigenous peoples. And so it's funny when Richard Bell will talk about Aboriginal art as a white thing, but then on the inverse of that Australian art is an Aboriginal thing that he says. And so our Indigenous canon, the critical contextualization of the experiences within this country, anyone that comes to this country after a certain point participates in our canon. And so there needs to be a realignment of who determines the power, the parameters of those conversations, and it's not just taking a template from European art and putting it over here. It's actually the other way around.
I mean, it's a complete. I don't want to say it's an upending, but the story of what you might call Aboriginal art isn't a narrative. It isn't a story. It isn't even a story. It's many stories. It's a complex. It's a cosmology. This work is a body of work is fascinating. It's an ongoing body of work. You've been at it for years. Just talk me through what you're trying to do here, because these are clearly the plaques we might see on a grave, and assembled as you would a wall of remembrance at a crematorium.
So I very familiar with museum archives and that type of setting. Looking at Kamilaroi cultural property within museums around Australia and overseas. So all of the plaques downstairs are Kamilaroi materials. They are real. Those index cards haven't been altered. Maybe a little here and there just to fit onto the scale. So the index cards, as a universal, standard, the dimensions being very key to that material. All of those plaques are made with the same dimensions and the same information. So the work's important because it creates accessibility. Many people don't know that cultural property continues to be housed in museums, natural history museums, anatomy departments for Aboriginal ancestral remains, all types of different settings that have our property and our ancestors. So creating accessibility, but then also recreating them as memorial plaques to think about what is remembered and what is forgotten, but then also thinking about the politics of death. If something's been remembered or it no longer exists, then what has led to that point? So my perspective is that cultural property within museums directly relates to cultural genocide, because there is cultural material inside of these places that Aboriginal people cannot access if it's not been repatriated. So you have forms in many communities, that come from certain communities that are no longer based there. Thinking of a condensed timeline of displacement, missionaries, people moved off, and a lot of those stakeholders, police, missionaries, giving cultural materials to museums. Then there's a breakdown in knowledge and practice because there has been people prosecuted for continuing those things. So then to continually house those materials within institutions today is further preventing that transmission of knowledge and that opportunity to provide maintenance to those cultures. And so in that way, museums and any other person or place that holds cultural materials and doesn't send it back to the traditional owners are complicit in cultural genocide.
And this repatriation work that was very much, part of what your dad did with FARA, the Foundation for Aboriginal and Islander Research Action in Queensland. This repatriation, and I kind of am doing this work too, the repatriation of cultural memory. How do we take from the European archive, for example, things that they don't even regard as artefacts or even significant, and they don't even know the value of the material they hold. That's what is shocking to me, is that we could go to a museum in London, British Museum, we could go to the Musée de Confluence in Lyon. We could go to those places and we could tell them what that material is and its meaning and it's why it's significant. And oh, that's interesting, isn't it? It's just because it's one of many thousands or millions of objects that they hold. So there are things that we can do that aren't repatriation of physical, say, ancestral remains. There's a whole lot of unseen repatriation work, and I'm interested in because we talked about this the other day. Repatriation isn't always of a physical object.
No.
Yeah.
There's that obviously because of the value and the history connected to those materials and ancestral remains. The what is necessary is repatriation, and for institutions to unquestionably commit to that. In that interim, there's also responsibility to repatriate knowledge that exists within those materials. So communities can empower ourselves with regenerating practices and things like that. Obviously, this is a kind of a murky area where there's a bunch of ethics that need to be considered for that to happen in an appropriate way. And so, it's a bit, there's some uncertainty around some of those things. What was the other thing you were saying?
I'm just the thing I wanted to kind of pick up on is the repatriation of anything other than physical. So knowledge, memory.
Yeah.
Because we can recover memories from these objects that I say are secreted in temperature-controlled vaults in museums overseas, in cupboards where no one sees them.
Yep.
I've been to museums in Europe and just been utterly confused as to why those things are there, when there's no sense of what they actually. I could tell them what those things were.
I think the main thing is that to jump back and forwards history to the contemporary, that if museums, art institutions, whatever it might be, if they had a stake in the historical contribution to those different dynamics, then they have a huge responsibility to contribute to that recalibration of power and
restitution
of that. And there is some really great examples around the world. Like when I was living over in North America for a little bit, the Gwich'in mob in northern Canada, they had this example where they no longer had caribou skin clothing, and so some of the elders from that community went and accessed and studied the caribou skin cloaks that were in that museum, and they started to regenerate the knowledge with that. They revived the practice, and then the museum then gave back the historical materials, and then put the new ones back in there. So representing living artists and living work as a really great opportunity to reflect continuing cultures, and not through some, curiosity kind of gaze of showing a relic from 100 years ago, because that's half the thing as this colonial trophy that people want to maintain. Not to mention, when you have huge collections in different institutions, then the gross wealth of that institution, a quarter of that might actually come from stolen materials that continue to disempower Aboriginal communities. And so we have to ask ourselves, like, if that's the case, then what is the donors, the patrons, the audience, the artists, the directors, what are people doing about it? Because at the moment, it's not much.
There's a question I think that your dad might well ask of you, or did ask of you, and that was, if the Prime Minister were to walk up to you today and ask you, what do you want? This is something that Richard Bell goes on about too. It's like, what are we actually fighting for? What is the, when we reach fulfillment, we actually get liberation, what do we do with it? What if the Prime Minister walked up to you today and said, what do you want?
Yeah, I wasn't expecting you to ask that question.
I know. It was going to be the last question, but I think, no, bring it forward.
I think that it's very hard to answer that on behalf of all black folks.
On behalf of yourself.
On behalf of myself, well, there might be conflicting interests as well there. So I think that we all go back to the main pursuit is land rights, and the sustainability and health of that, having a connection to that. And so I think the most important thing has always been land rights. That's what the struggle in every single way goes back to that. That's where language comes from. That's where cultural epistemology comes from. Yep. And so that's if that's the core, then that's always the aspiration. That doesn't mean farmers need to get all paranoid that they're going to get shipped off, but it's where that's the pursuit. I think to think about what we want, there you go. A
way of thinking about it is, what do you want for your children? Like, what's the base level at which, from which we can move, for which you individually can move forward, so that you've provided for them.
Well, as a parent, yeah, I want my children to grow up in a country that sees them as valid and integral to society, with their cultural integrity intact, not to be seen as the other, not to be dehumanized, not to be all that stuff. And I think that, again, there's a huge responsibility on non-Indigenous Australians to do that heavy lifting, because the onus falls on us, and it's because we can't avoid its impacts. And so I think that there needs to be more discourse and conversations. Like, even thinking about non-Indigenous artists, it's like out of bounds for many artists who are non-Indigenous to create work around colonialism, whether because that's too triggering for their own sense of identity, going back to somewhere in Europe, or how superficial Australian identity is, for a number of reasons. I think that as a part of that, there needs to be genuine partnership in contributing to that conversation. There are many artists who do that really well, authentically, and I think that there needs to be more people. Just because there's a certain experience of history doesn't mean that those people shouldn't be contributing. So I think land is always the main thing, but to also get to that point, I really think that there needs to be some type of tangible body that has teeth that can actually legislate and advocate for something more, because at the moment, any pursuit to try and empower and liberate ourselves from those histories has red tape that's tied it off, where you'll be prosecuted, you'll be seen as a criminal, you some other sort of negative outcome. And so I think it's really important that there is some freedom in understanding these things need to change, and why should we be criminalised to just maintain our cultural rights? The main thing is, if there's a lot of people who will try and dichotomise political Aboriginal practice, customary Aboriginal practice, and all of these things, and seeing them as this binary of completely opposite ends of the spectrum. But it's like Aboriginal art, when you think about it in that sort of traditional sense, customary forms and stuff, is a representation of that relationship to country. So contemporary political practice is the same thing, but it's when that relationship has been impacted. So they're not different, they're a part of the same thing, and one is highlighting the relationship, one is highlighting that relationship that's been impacted. And so in that way, there needs to be more understanding about, if these things didn't exist, all of these political hurdles and experiences, then we'd be making work about our cultural background. We would be continuing cultural practices. We would be providing cultural maintenance. But until that point, you can't access your country. You can't relearn your language without getting some white fella to acknowledge that they own the copyright of the text in the museum, or to try and lay your ancestors to rest because someone's still doing bone and dental scrapings on them to pursue some white fella dream of we're inferior. There has to be some more heavy lifting by non-Indigenous peoples to help support that pursuit.
Thank you. I mean, I would just direct everyone back to the work. The work is phenomenal, as I say, refined, elegantly small is what I would say about the show. But as I say, every piece of work is actually a refinement of a body of work. Could you please join me in thanking Warraba Weatherall?
Thank you.